We live in difficult and challenging times. How can academia contribute to diffuse polarization, to expand policy options? In part, it can do so by engaging in public dialogue. About this and many other fascinating topics is this conversation with Ulises Mejias in this episode of El Café Latinx. What is the experience of being a Latinx or Latin American scholar in the field of communication and media studies? What are the main challenges and opportunities that come with our identities? These are the issues that we'll talk about in El Café Latinx, where some of the leading voices in the field will share their professional experiences. Hola, my name is Pablo Boczkowski. I teach at Northwestern University, where I hold the Hamid bin Khalif Al Thani Chair in Communication. Together with Mora Matassi, doctoral student at Northwestern and executive producer of this podcast, we invite you to discover the journeys of scholars who are at the cutting edge of creating knowledge about Latinx or Latin American communities across the Americas. These are our stories. Esas son nuestras historias. Estas son nuestras historias. Hello everybody and welcome to this new episode of El Café Latinx. I am delighted to have with us today Ulises Mejias. Ulises is professor in the Department of Communication Studies at State University of New York, the College of Oswego, where he has been affiliated in a faculty capacity since 2007. Since 2015, he's also the director of the Institute for Global Engagement at the same university. He did his Bachelor in Fine Arts and his Master of Science at Ithaca College, not very far from SUNY Oswego, and his doctorate in education at Teachers College at Columbia University. Just, 4.5 hours south driving to the city. He is one of the foremost experts in critical internet studies, sociology and anthropology of data, political economy of digital media. He has many publications, most recently his second book, The Cost of Connection, co-authored with Nick Couldry. We are truly delighted to have you with us today. Ulises, welcome to El Café Latinx.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here and very excited. We're missing the coffee, but everything else is here, I think.
All right. We have the virtual coffee with us.
Yes.
So Ulises, tell us, how did it all begin? That is, how's the start of the journey that led you to become a professor?
Yes. Thank you, Pablo. Also, we don't often get opportunities like this to reflect on our trajectory, so I'm very touched that you asked me to participate in this podcast.
Oh, thank you. Please.
Well, yes. How did it all begin? I think, for me, I would probably frame it in terms of crossing of a boundary and crossing of a border. And I want to be very careful here because as someone originally from Mexico, I think obviously when we talk about crossing borders, it means something very specific. And I want to acknowledge right off the bat that my crossing of the Mexico-US border was from a very privileged position. I think it's tragic, and it saddens me a lot to see the kind of experiences Mexicans and other Latin Americans are having these days, just in terms of crossing that border. But my crossing of that border was very privileged. I was one of 20 students, Mexican students, selected by the Institute of International Education for a scholarship program. So after I finished high school in Mexico, I applied in this program, and they select around 20 students. And basically what they do is they help you apply for college in the United States. So that whole big process that was completely unknown to me of applying for colleges and writing the letters and all that, they took care of submitting the materials. I, of course, only had to do the writing, the providing of the data. And then I was offered, I was accepted, offered various scholarships, ended up coming to Ithaca, an Ithaca college. But as I look back, I think it was that crossing that initiated a process of self-reflection. I mean, to put it simply, Pablo, I think if I had stayed in Mexico, I would be, perhaps I would be a scholar today, but maybe interested in very different things. And if I had been born here in the United States, I don't think my approach to the issues I'm dealing with would be the same. This might seem kind of obvious, perhaps, to you and to the listeners. But I think, to me, that process of confronting that difference and confronting that difference within myself, which forced me to rethink how I thought of myself as someone from this country now studying in this other country, I think that initiated the process of trying to reconcile, trying to put together different things, which hopefully you continue to see now in my work on data colonialism, right? Trying to put two things together that maybe usually we don't think of those two things as going together, data on the one hand, colonialism on the other. So that interplay, that hybridity, which many people have talked about and written about, I think now I see myself embodying it and having started that whole process with that process of crossing that border.
Okay, that's very interesting. So following up on that, the book on data colonialism has been exceedingly impactful, even though it's only been out less than 2 years ago, right? Not even.
Yes, August of 2019.
Right, a year and a half ago. So how did that project come about? Because there is, also there is a crossing of the Atlantic Ocean in the authoring team, right? How did that emerge, and how was the collaboration? How was writing with Nick? Tell us a little bit about the behind the scenes on that project.
Yes, well, that in itself is a very rewarding story and something I'm very fortunate to have found myself in this position. Because I think, when we're speaking, as I was just speaking about this crossing of a border as enabling certain conceptualizations, in the case of this particular project and the book, The Cost of Connections, The Cost of Connection, it wouldn't have been possible also without Nick's presence and his contribution, his ideas, the opportunity to develop the ideas in conversation with him. So I think maybe, the ability to bring certain kinds of fields in conversation with each other was something that I realized is as an opportunity. This was something that could be useful, but it was in collaboration with Nick that those ideas were fully formed. And so from my experience, this is the first time I co-authored anything seriously with anybody. I mean, I have other projects with students, etc., but this was my first true collaboration in that sense. And like you pointed out, it's not like Nick and I are part of the same institution. We don't even live in the same country. So that initial contact, I think, was also very interesting. We just know each other from conferences, from attending the same talks. We were, of course, aware of each other's work. So I think the first time we met in person was at a conference in Cambridge. And so I think, from the beginning, it was clear that we were interested in many of the same things. And so originally, I think I proposed a collaboration. I thought, I like Nick's ideas. I think I could learn a lot from having this kind of conversation with him. So I suggested, why don't we write an article? And he came back and said, why don't we write a book? So I thought, okay, maybe I wasn't prepared for that. I was a little bit intimidated by the prospect of, just in terms of the length. I have written one previous book, Unthinking the Network, from University of Minnesota Press. So that was my experience, as a solitary writer. And so the idea, I think, appealed to me, but I was a little bit nervous about what that would take. But I think Nick and I have different abilities that complement each other very well. I mean, we also have many similar abilities, which also helps, and we speak the same language when it comes to the theorizing and the conceptualization. But I think it was a very productive partnership from my perspective in that sense, in which I think he's very good at doing certain things. I'm good at doing other things. By the time we put it all together, I think, it was a very fruitful collaboration. And I think both he and I believe that, as we say, the sum of the parts or is greater than the whole, that kind of thing. I think we are both very pleased with the result, in the sense that we recognize this is not something either one of us could have done by ourselves. It only happened because we came together and we collaborated in these ideas together.
Excellent. Now, I want to delve a little bit deeper on the mechanics of the collaboration, thinking in particular about potentially younger listeners who are getting started in their careers. There is, as you know, a trend towards more teamwork in the academy, in particular more on the sort of quantitative or behavioral side of the communications field, media studies field. But it's becoming also more common on the sort of culturally oriented, interpretive, humanistic side, from which both you and Nick come from. So for our younger, listeners, so people getting started in the art of, collaboration in a big project, right? How did you do it? So did you divide the chapters and then each of you took the lead on one and then edited the other? Were you at any point writing in a collocated fashion in the same city and then trading drafts, or was it all with an ocean in between? And having done this so successfully, you have do's and don'ts of how to do this?
Right. Yes, great. Thanks for that question. I would say it was a mixture of all of the things you mentioned. I mean, just as far as the logistics, there was a lot of emailing back and forth, but Nick did have the opportunity to visit Ithaca, and we spent some days just, locked up here at home and just thinking and writing and discussing. I think just in terms of energy levels, I'm not, afraid to say, Nick, I think, has a lot more creative energy than I do. I think I'm more of a contemplative person, and I like to discuss something, but then I need to kind of retreat and process it on my own, whereas he can just keep going. And then he goes back and writes on his own, and then he's ready the next day. So I love that energy, and it was very important for the project too. So thankfully, we did have the opportunity to both collaborate in person and online too as well. At the beginning, I think, we had lots of conversations about the theme, the topics. We continuously suggested things that the other person should read. I think, just to give you an example, in terms of post-colonial theory, all of that, I was sending things to him, telling him, you need to read this. This is something I find very interesting or insightful. He was sending me lots of things, and just more like the sociological approach to the study of media. So that was amazing too, just to have someone, that can in some ways bombard you with reading suggestions while you're doing the same as well. That was very productive. So we did initially say, why don't I start writing a chapter on this, and you can write a chapter on that. And then when we had drafts, we would share them with each other. We would provide comments. I think it's true that our writing styles are a little bit different. So just in terms of thinking about the voice and tone in the final product, we have to start thinking about, okay, how is this going to sound? How is this, what tone should we approach here or there? So we had all of those conversations. And what we did then is we each took responsibility for writing some of what I would call the middle chapters. And then we wrote together more the introduction and the conclusion. I think, to add more complexity to all of this, our teaching schedules are very different. Our teaching loads sometimes can be very different. I'm at a state institution where teaching loads are kind of higher. Nick fortunately had a little bit more time at some points of the year where he could devote more time, but then at other times he was very busy with his own teaching. So it was a logistics challenge to get all of this done. But I think we managed to do okay. As far as your question about, what advice I would give to someone, I think what this experience taught me is that I think sometimes in partnerships, and maybe this applies to all sorts of partnerships, friendships, romantic partnerships, as well as work partnerships, we look for someone who can make us comfortable. We look for someone who is similar, who can, maybe the level of expertise is the same so that we feel comfortable. I would say in this particular case, and actually this is the advice I would give also when it comes to friendships and even romantic relationships, don't get too comfortable. Don't seek out that similarity, because at the end of the day, it's a difference that generates interesting insights. It's the difference that is productive. So in many ways, like I said, Nick and I have some similarities, but in other ways, we're very different people, very different backgrounds, very different skill sets, very different cultural sensibilities and upbringing, very different disciplines. He's a sociologist, whereas I am more of an interdisciplinary communication scholar, also interested in education and, very different in that sense. But looking back, it was those differences, that ability to unsettle and to live with that diversity and to experience what it means then to have to defend your position, what it means to be able to bring an idea from a field, from a perspective that the other person wasn't contemplating at all because that area is so completely new to them. That was, I think, the enriching part. So I think that's the advice I would give, that be willing to take risks, be willing to take chances. And I've seen, not to get too much into the personal stuff, but I think in my own marriage, I think this lesson applies as well, because my wife is from Pakistan. My wife is also very different from who I am, but it's been those differences, I think, that have provided that richness in our relationship and in our marriage. So it applies to friendships, it applies to love. I would suggest it applies also to academic collaborations where we need to be comfortable with those differences. Of course, that's how it's worked out for me. Maybe I don't know what the experience has been in your case. Maybe sometimes working with someone who's very similar has been productive, or for listeners, but that has been my experience at least.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, how long did the project take from the time you first discussed the possibility of a book until the time you sent the final version of the manuscript?
Yeah.
More or less.
I'm very bad with dates, but
sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay, because I think also what happens is that it was so intense and so many things were happening, and I was trying to balance this with the teaching. and with service. And you know how academic life is. I think really we started to think about this project in 2013, 2014. We had an opportunity to, meet and discuss things. And really, I would say the bulk of the writing really happened across a period of 3 years, which is kind of intense if you think about it. Because then by 2018, obviously, I would say even by 2017, we had the draft in pretty good shape, and we started sending it out. Well, by that time, we already had a contract with Stanford, but and as you know, publishing takes a long time as well, just the actual process of the editing and the printing and all of that. So yes, it took about at least a year, just, of us sitting there waiting for the book to finally come out. But this is, again, also an area in which Nick is an expert and very good, because he said, while we wait for the book, we should have an article, a journal article that comes out earlier. So we have an article that came out with in the journal Television and New Media. We were very fortunate also to be approached by the editors of this specific volume, Stefania Milan and Emiliano Trede, which I'm sure you know as well. So that was the other exciting part about this. Even though we kind of came up with the idea of data colonialism, or we thought we did, by the time publication was ready, we started to realize other people have been thinking about this. Maybe not in the exact same terms, but in similar terms. And I think also it's worth mentioning the work of Paula Ricaurte, also from Mexico. So yes, we were able to put together this article which summarizes our argument, and basically it came out in 2018, and it started to introduce the idea of data colonialism to an audience. I think the article has been very successful. Fortunately, it's been downloaded more than 11,000 times by now. So this was great planning, I think, on Nick's part, really, that while we wait for the book to come out, we should have an article that begins to open the conversation and to get the ideas out there. So that's part of it as well. And even after the publication of the book, we published other things. So it's become a larger project. It's not just about the one book, I would say.
Okay, that's very interesting. And since you mentioned Paola or Paula?
Paola.
Paola. Yeah. So another aspect of this intellectual journey is the project that you have with her, right? I mean, you, Nick, and her lead Tierra Común.
Tierra Común,
right?
Yes.
How did that come about? And what it consists, and if you could explain a little bit what it consists of for the listeners.
Yes. So Tierra Común, again, Paola Ricaurte teaches at the ITESM, a school in Mexico. And I think the very first time we introduced these ideas about data colonialism, actually Nick had the opportunity to attend a conference in Colombia. At that time I was teaching and I couldn't join there. But I think that's the first time that we started talking about data colonialism in public. And Paola was there at that same conference. So of course they immediately realized the alignment in terms of certain projects and ideas. And so he introduced me to Paola. We started conversations, discussions, and sharing writing as well. Paola, by the way, also has an article in this same volume of the journal I was mentioning, TVNM, Television and New Media. So she was also able to write something for that. At some point in 2019, we were invited to go to Mexico, which is my homeland. So this was a very important journey for me because it was really the first time I had presented work here and there before, but it was really the first time where I was presenting substantially my work to a Mexican audience. And Paula was key in organizing the trip and inviting us to participate here and there. So during that trip, I think she and Nick were talking about this idea of Tierra Común originated, which is really a network. So we don't want the ideas of Tierra Común just to be, academic ideas that live in journals and people read them and discuss them, and that's it. Nick and Paola were really central to putting this idea together. And they realized that, if we want to form a network of people interested in these issues, which clearly there is such a network, it needs to be virtual. It needs to be provide an online space for us to interact, because traveling in Latin America might be more difficult to some people than others. The resources are not always there. So Tierra Común emerged as this network of scholars, yes, but also activists, basically who are interested in exploring this concept of data colonialism as it is lived in the global South, as it is lived particularly in Latin America. So that's sort of how the idea came about. Like I said, Nick and Paola were the key players there to put it together. They asked me to come on board, and so then we started inviting people. And by now, as you know very well, it's quite a large group. I think, of course, then the pandemic came along, which made certain kinds of collaborations more difficult. But we have had a couple of meetings. And so I think it's from my perspective, it's been a very enriching and engaging network. I think even though, as I started to say at the beginning, my journey into academia started with crossing of that border, I think, as you know very well, those border crossings always happen also along colonial lines. And to this day, most of my interactions have been with the West and with the North. And as a Latino, I've obviously been in Mexico, my homeland, and to Guatemala, and that's it. And I don't know too many people from the rest of Latin America. And so, again, this was a lesson in the coloniality of the flows of information, right? Even when we talk about academia. And so through Tierra Común and through the work of writing the book, I've gotten to know people like you, and I've gotten to know all the integrantes of Tierra Común and share my work with them. So that's been an amazing experience, just to form those connections outside of the traditional colonial flows of information between the South and the North.
Fabulous. Has that experience begun to sort of shape also how you approach research issues, research questions or topics, even though it's fairly recent? But I agree with you, there is much more North-South than South-South, right?
Yes.
So, but has that had already, do you see, sort of an effect in the questions you ask, the projects you imagine, etc.?
For sure, certainly. I think the way I see it is, this project of putting together the book and the concepts around data colonialism, in some ways, it is a theoretical framework. And I know, we're past the age of meta-narratives and big theoretical frameworks just for the sake of theory. But I think Nick and I felt that it was necessary, whatever critiques of datafication and the information society and the digital age and data capitalism and all of that, surveillance capitalism, where we were encountering, we felt they did not go far enough. They didn't provide this umbrella framework for understanding what's happening in both the North and the South, what's happening in social media, but what's also happening in terms of surveillance and the gig economy. So we very much wanted to put together a framework to try to understand all of these issues. And that framework, of course, is influenced by post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, and the 500 years of trying to make sense of colonialism and then capitalism. But now that that theory is there, I think, at least from my perspective, This experience has allowed me to start to fill in the holes and start to listen to the voices that fill in the holes, that provide the actual supporting data that makes the framework valid and useful at all. So through networks like Tierra Común, I got to know people who are doing the research on site. I've gotten to, I've had the opportunity to listen to the research that people are doing in Argentina or in Ecuador or in Brazil. And so to me, that's been incredibly enriching to basically, find the supporting evidence for this larger theory, right? That at the moment we were conceptualizing it, Nick and I, we knew, of course, the evidence and the supporting and the fact that people have been doing this work in the global south for decades. So by no means did we think we were, creating something completely new. But as a result of publishing this work, I think the most enriching and rewarding experience for me has been to get to know these people who are doing this research throughout the world, in particular in Latin America, and their research in turn is shaping the way I think about these issues. Their research is shaping the questions that I ask. And in getting to know people like you, Pablo, and reading your own work, I think, of course, that always has that effect on our own work and on our own understanding of the world and I think our own understanding of ourselves. So that has been amazing.
Excellent. Now, speaking about understandings of oneself, you mentioned several times your positionality as a Latino person, and you're also Latin American by origin, Mexican in particular. So how has that sort of play out in your academic practice? Not just your research, but your teaching, your community service, your networking, your experience at conferences, etc. Has that affected at all? And if so, how?
Of course it has. I think in different ways and at different points, I related to those identities and differences differently. I think, let me think about this, or how to put this. I think it's made me a better teacher and a more reflective teacher, for instance. But I do want to start by acknowledging, again, just as I did at the beginning, that my position as a white Hispanic, when I fill out the census here in the United States, there's a box specifically for people like me, which means the way I interpret it, looks white, but is not white inside, right? So in many ways, I do want to acknowledge, again, the privilege that comes with that, because I can walk into a store, I can perhaps even go to a gun show, and people will not look at me in a funny way, right? My experience of racism has been very different because I pass as white, basically. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, which doesn't mean I haven't experienced racism or discrimination. After 9/11, even in a super liberal town like Ithaca, our neighbors came to tell us that now was the time for people who hate the United States to get out of the country. But that was because I am married to someone from Pakistan and we are Muslim. So, and they happen to know that. But racially, of course, they wouldn't be able, just looking at me, to make any assumptions. So, in some ways, yes, a white Hispanic means I pass as white, but I definitely don't feel like white inside. And to the extent that I've been able to play with that difference in the classroom, for instance, I think it has been very productive because I've been able to use that in some ways to challenge students' assumptions. Because again, they see me and they assume white professor, yes, with a weird name. But then once I start to talk to them about certain political ideas and where I come from, and so they realize, okay, this what's going on here? I think they go through the same process I've been going through. So it has shaped my teaching. It has, of course, shaped my research. I think there it's been kind of like the opposite effect, right? Because I think when people see my name in publications or when they see my name in conference proceedings, of course, they can immediately realize I am not a traditional white Anglo person. So they again make certain assumptions, and then when I get up to approach the podium or whatever, so there's that moment of cognitive dissonance, right? Again, the white person that's not white. So yes, it has definitely shaped, I would say, all aspects of my work in terms of the kinds of scholarship I do and in terms of the kinds of teaching I do, for sure.
And for networking, for the conference circuit and all of that, have you noticed that plays a role as well? I'm asking because previous guests in the podcast have mentioned that. Not necessarily how they position themselves, but how they are positioned by others. Have you seen that? Experienced that? Not seen, but experienced that.
I think so. I think it's true. And, to be honest, and I think Nick would be okay with me sharing this, but we have talked about, for instance, the way in which different people make different assumptions about who's the main author of the book, which is quite interesting because, and it goes both ways, by the way. We consider our work to be co-authored, mm-hmm. and I think we're both perfectly comfortable saying, this is a joint work. It was shaped, conceptualized by both of us. It was written by both of us. But it is interesting to see how, for instance, sometimes invitations come to him. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, as the author of The Cost of Connection, can you please come and talk to me? Sometimes invitations come to me. So I'm not saying, by any means that this is just a one-way thing. So we've talked about it and we laughed about it. And I think we have sort of agreed that how those things happen says more about the people making those assumptions than it's not about us, in other words. Mm-hmm. It's not about us. It has to do with the people who might make some assumptions about, well, this is a work on data colonialism, so therefore Nick Coltree must be the main author. Or, on the other hand, Ulises Mejias must be the main author because it is about data colonialism. So it's kind of interesting to see how that happens. But I think the interesting part to me, Pablo, is that what do we do with those assumptions? Once they are made, do they open up spaces for us to intervene? And so I would say that no matter what assumptions have been made in terms of inviting me, not inviting me, or whatever, I always take that space as an opportunity to intervene and to say what I need to say. So I never just take it as a given, or I try to anyway, not take it as a given. It always opens up doors and opportunities to make an intervention and say what you need to say.
And in terms of making an intervention and say what you need to say, if you had magical powers and could be granted one wish about how you would like the field of communication and media studies to change, what would you wish for?
Yes, I only get one wish. I have to complain.
You can have more than one. As many as you wish.
I have a long list of I have a long list of things that I would like to change. So it's I want to be limited, no, but I get your point, and I'll try to keep it short because I do have lots of ideas, not just about our field, but about academia in general. Mm-hmm. I think, for instance, I would love it if we can move to a 4-day week in academia. and reserve Fridays for some sort of day of service, not in the traditional way in which universities think about it, but as a day in which students, along with faculty, along with staff, can just dedicate to, grappling with projects that benefit our communities, that benefit society. So I would love lots of different things like that. But I think in terms of just keeping it to one wish, I've been actually discussing with my students I am teaching a graduate class on science, technology, and the media. And so we've been talking a lot about science journalism. And there was one article in particular recently that I liked. The authors are Nisbet and Fahy, and the article is New Models of Knowledge-Based Journalism. And what I liked about it is the way in which they ascribe three functions to the science journalist, which I think are functions that we need to, as scholars, also adopt. There's been a lot of talk recently about public humanities, about doing humanities in terms of projects that benefit the public. I think we need to also talk about public communication, or public media studies, perhaps. And to do that, I think we need these three functions. I think my wish is that we all become knowledge brokers, which means accept the responsibility of our job, which is basically, as communication scholars, to translate, to explain, to take complicated ideas and unpack them and critique them and analyze them and offer new conclusions and offer new insights, in a public-facing way, as a way to do some sort of service in our communities. So that's the first function, to be knowledge brokers. The second one is as dialogue brokers, because as I just mentioned, I think the job of the scholar is not just to publish something and go home. These interventions, theoretical, empirical, quantitative, qualitative, whatever we're doing, I think we need to engage the public and we need to create dialogue. I think we need to convene discussions with the public through our work. The idea that, what I do is just write books and then that's all I do, I think my wish is that we abandon that idea, that we fully think of ourselves as public scholars. And then the last function is the function of a public broker that these authors of this article I'm mentioning talk about, basically acknowledging that we live in very controversial times. I think what the public communication scholar can do, and this is my final wish, is that we can diffuse some of this controversy. We can diffuse some of this polarization around these controversies by, as these authors say, by expanding the range of policy options, by by engaging in dialogues, by engaging with the public in these dialogues about, what are the options, the policy options that we have available to deal with this problem. It's not just, I believe that global warming is real and the only way to solve it is this issue. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have people who believe global warming is not real. And so then we need to present a range of policy options that allow us to make progress and solve these issues, but approach them as discussions, not just get centered on our own opinions, ideologies, and pretend that there's only one solution to these problems. I think our role as public scholars doing public communication is precisely about facilitating these conversations.
Wonderful, wonderful, very insightful. Thank you very much, Ulises. It's been a pleasure to have you with us in this episode of El Café Latinx. I want to thank you again. I want to thank our listeners for staying to the end and invite them to join us for the next one. Ulises, my friend, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Muchas gracias. Hasta la próxima.
El Café Latinx is a production of the Center for Latinx Digital Media in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. I am Pablo Boczkowski, your host, and I'm joined by executive producer Mora Matassi.